Many years ago, they used to believe that you should start your car up, let it run 10, 15 minutes, and then gently set off. But I'm here to tell you there's many reasons why, in fact, that would be a stupid idea, and you definitely want to start your car, wait briefly, and then set out. Life's too short to drive boring cars. So when it's cold out like this, here's what you don't want to do. But instead, here's some key things to think about. When your car's idling, it's running at low RPM. In other words, your alternator is minimally charging your battery. So it's not going to kill your battery, but it's not charging your battery. And when you're faced with winter or colder driving conditions, you definitely want to make sure you have a fully charged battery. So idling it too long actually prevents the car to properly charge up to its normal high charge rate. You definitely want to get the vehicle running so that it actually elevates, spins the alternator a little faster, and charges the battery at an accelerated rate. Another reason you don't necessarily need to idle your vehicle too long is the use of modern day oils. A lot of modern day oils like this one, for example, we're talking what's fully synthetic. As you can see, the 030 right there means that it's rated for colder temperatures. Synthetic oil as well has a great viscosity and is actually quite thin at lower temps. Meaning, in other words, it does a few things. It lubricates the parts much easier and it flows from the oil pump a lot easier. So in other words, it gets around the engine a lot quicker than your conventional diesel oil. I had cars years ago that would run a 2050. That oil would take forever to get through the system and build the appropriate amount of oil pressure. Nowadays, oil pressure is built within a few short seconds. So by the time you got your seatbelt on, it's pretty much built up and ready to go. Another reason you really shouldn't idle your vehicle very long is because the EPA. The EPA actually states that you should not necessarily idle your vehicle any more than about 30 seconds. Now that is kind of variable, and given the type of temperatures you might expose yourself to if you live in Florida, that's one conversation. If you live in a place like Canada like this where it's minus 20, you might have to give it a few seconds longer. But 30 seconds to a minute is really all that you really need to reduce the amount of emissions going up in the atmosphere so we can all live in this beautiful, happy globe that we call Earth. Another reason you really shouldn't idle your vehicle too long is because you're overheating some of the engine components and it can cost you dearly in the end. Of course, you have the engine here and it's the top section. It's called the heads. That carries the valves, and it's the valves on the heads that can start overheating because the engine can start heating up internally very excessively in the heads and around the valve guides and the valve guide seals and can create accelerated wear and tear to the guides. If you do this long term as a habit, what you can actually have is accelerated valve guide seal wear, and then you could wind up with smoking. Excess oil consumption can result after a few short years if this is the normal way you do this. Because that heat has no way of escaping. When you're driving your car and you're revving it up and revving it down, that heat comes and goes through vacuum and positive pressure, and that heat moves through the engine rather than sitting in there and building up as a heat source. Another place is your catalytic converter, which is buried underneath the vehicle. Those can cost you thousands of dollars if you have to replace them. They start excessively heating when the vehicle idles too long. If your catalytic converter heats up too much, it can burn it out. And that could just mean a huge repair bill down the road. Another great reason actually for not idling your vehicle too long. Now remember, a bunch of years ago, you used to have vehicles that actually would take a lot of effort to get it started. You'd have to pump it 3 times, crank it, it would stumble, and maybe it would start, then you'd have to try it again, and you'd have to do this over and over again. A lot of it had to do with the induction system and, of course, the fuel injection system, which back in the day, they were carbureted, not fuel injected like modern day cars. Today, they're very complex systems, and they use lots of sensors throughout under the hood and under the car that provide all the feedback to the engine and the computer to tell the vehicle what to do and what to do it next. For example, there's oxygen sensors mounted to the exhaust system that tell you the amount of mixture and CO emissions are going out the backside. Now that coupled with other sensors, for example, we have mass airflow sensors, which now detect the amount of airflow into the intake manifold, which provides the amount of right metering for the vehicle and the computer. So the computer knows how to balance it best. It knows the air mixture coming in, the density of the air. It knows what's going out the exhaust system and makes the right calculations. So when you start the car, it automatically makes the appropriate fuel mixture to get the vehicle not just running, but holds it at idle. Back in the day, you used to need a choke system on the carburetor. You'd have to pump it. Some vehicles, they actually had a choke, and you had to activate the choke so much. Otherwise, too much air in the vehicle just wouldn't start. So you had to choke it out and give it a little more fuel. Nowadays, none of that's required. The vehicle just starts and it runs reliably, consistently, right from the get-go. Now the idle just purrs like a kitten from the time you start it cold to the time you set off 30 seconds to 60 seconds later. So the best thing you can do for your car is start it, let it idle for about 30 seconds if you're in warm climates, then set off. If you're in a little colder climates, let it run for 30 seconds to 60 seconds. By the time you get your radio station dialed in, you get your seatbelt in, and you figure out where you're headed, it's probably time to set off. Now, the one thing to keep in mind is the rear differential is often cold, so things are stiff there. The transmission's also a little cold too, and the engine still is a little bit cold. So I'd advise you keeping the RPM down and don't rev it high because the rod bearings and other internal parts are still expanding. So there's some additional caution that you want to make until the vehicle's at its full operating temperature. And every vehicle has its own limits within their range, but take a look at your gauge and you know pretty quickly. In this Jaguar, you'll see the temperature gauge is midway, and that's where it is when it's fully warmed. So now we're ready to go. Now you can set the full beans and rev it as much as you need to accelerate up to speed. Now, 2 other quick pointers. Your fuel, especially when it's cold outside, do not let it get too low. If you let the fuel level drop too low, you can get moisture separating, you can get debris, and that can wind up in your fuel injection system, which can cause you other drivability issues. Another key important factor to consider is check engine lights. Remember, we're relying on the computer to do its magic. Uses sensors inputs, for example, oxygen sensors. If you have a check engine light, your computer will not function properly, and you can't accurately rely on the computer to make all those right decisions for you if it means driving your car with caution and attention. So don't neglect the check engine lights. Make sure your fuel is good to go, but it's a short warm-up, and you set off to your next destination. And with all of that said right there, check that great video. It's going to be really helpful if you're looking at tips how to prevent ruining your automatic transmission. Hope to see each and every one of you on the next one. Catch you real soon. Bye-bye.